They sent her back before noon, and by sundown, no one in that town would forget the man who didn't look away. The wagon wheels were still creaking when the driver tossed the suitcase down. A worn leather case that hit the dirt like it had been dropped too many times before, dust rising in a slow, lazy cloud under the dry Wyoming sun. And she stepped down after it without a word, boots landing firm, shoulders straight, as if she refused to let the ground take anything else from her. People gathered the way they always did, not out of concern but curiosity, eyes narrowing, whispers drifting through the heat like smoke, judging before asking, deciding before knowing, and somewhere between the laughter and the silence that followed, her name was already gone, replaced by something smaller, something easier to dismiss. Ethan Cole stood 20 feet away under the shade of a splintered wooden awning, one hand resting loose at his side, the other curled against the rail, watching the scene unfold with the kind of stillness that made people forget he was there at all. But he saw everything the way. Her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle until her knuckles turned pale, the way her chin lifted just slightly when the driver muttered something about stubbornness, about wasted money, about sending her back where she came from. She didn't answer him, not with words, but her eyes moved across the crowd once, steady and unflinching, and for a moment, something shifted in the air, something quiet but heavy, like the pause before a storm decides whether to break. A man pushed through then, the one who had ordered her like she was a piece of freight, his boots kicking up dust as he approached, voice sharp and certain, reaching for her arm as if the matter had already been settled. But she stepped back just enough, not in fear, not in retreat, just enough to draw a line no one else could see. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low, controlled, carrying farther than it should have in that dry heat. "I'm not something you can send back." And the street fell still in a way that made even the wind hesitate. Ethan felt it then, not the words, but what sat behind them. Something harder than pride, something older than defiance. And his gaze dropped for a second when a glint caught the sunlight, a small turquoise pendant slipping loose against her collarbone before disappearing again beneath the fabric. Just a flicker, just enough to tell him she didn't belong to this place, not the way they thought. The man laughed, others joined, one voice turning into many, the kind of laughter that tries to make truth sound foolish. But Ethan didn't laugh, didn't move, not until the man reached again, closer this time, like he meant to finish what he started. And that was when Ethan stepped forward, slow, deliberate, boots pressing into the dust like he had all the time in the world, placing himself between them without raising his voice, without reaching for his gun, just standing there as if that alone was enough to change the direction of things. The laughter faded first, then the whispers, and for the first time that day, no one spoke because something had shifted, something quiet but undeniable. And in that silence, under that wide, unforgiving sky, a man who never got involved had just made a choice that would follow them all into the night. The man did not step back, but he did not step forward either. And that small hesitation hung in the air like heat over the plains, stretching the moment longer than anyone expected, while Ethan Cole stood there with a shadow cutting across the dust between them, saying nothing, doing nothing more than existing in a way that made the space feel smaller, tighter, harder to ignore. The buyer cleared his throat, trying to gather what little authority he still had, brushing invisible dirt from his coat as if that might restore the balance. But his voice came out thinner this time, less certain. "She is mine, paid and delivered," he said, though the words did not land the same way they had minutes ago, not with that quiet line drawn in front of him. Ethan did not look at the man when he answered, his eyes still on the woman, steady, measuring, as if he were reading something written beneath her silence. "People are not cattle," he said, simple and flat, the kind of sentence that did not ask for agreement, only acknowledgement. A murmur moved through the small crowd, shifting feet, glances traded, the weight of habit pressing against something new, something uncomfortable, and the buyer laughed again, louder this time, trying to pull the moment back into something familiar, but it sounded forced, like a door that would not quite close. The woman did not move, did not speak again, but her grip on the suitcase loosened just enough to show she had heard, that she understood what had just been placed in front of her. Not protection, not ownership, but something else entirely, something she had not expected to find in a place like this. A breeze rolled through the street, carrying the dry scent of wood and leather, stirring the edges of her dress. And for a brief second, the turquoise pendant slipped free again, catching the light in a way that did not belong to this town, a quiet flash of another world, another set of rules. And Ethan noticed it again, this time longer long, enough to recognize that it was not decoration, but meaning, not something bought, but something carried. The buyer saw the glance and followed it, his expression tightening, suspicion flickering behind his eyes. "You think you know what she is?" he asked, but the question was not really for Ethan. It was for himself, for the doubt that had begun to creep in where certainty once lived. Ethan finally shifted his gaze, slow and deliberate, meeting the man's eyes without raising his voice. "I know what she is not," he said, and that was enough to tip something over the edge. No one moved for a long second. Not the crowd, not the driver who had started all this, not even the horses tied along the rail, as if the whole street had decided to wait and see which way the moment would fall. And then, just as quietly as it had built, the tension eased, not broken, not resolved, but redirected, the buyer stepping back half a pace. Not in surrender, not in defeat, but in calculation, his eyes narrowing as if he were measuring a cost he had not expected to pay. "This is not finished," he said finally, the words landing softer than he intended, before turning away, boots pressing into the dirt with less certainty than before, and the crowd began to drift with him, the way people do when they no longer want to be part of something they do not fully understand. Ethan remained where he was, the space around him opening up as the street cleared, leaving only the dust, the fading heat, and the woman standing with her suitcase still at her side, her eyes lifting to meet his for the first time, without interruption. And in that look there was no gratitude, no relief, only a quiet question that. Neither of them spoke, because out here, in a place where everything had a price, the rarest thing of all was a moment that did not ask for anything in return. The street emptied faster than it should have, like people were eager to leave behind something they could not quite explain, boots fading into the distance, doors closing one by one, until only the dry wind and the faint creak of a swinging sign remained. And she was still there, standing with that same quiet steadiness, the suitcase at her side, the dust settling around her boots, as if the ground itself had decided to stop questioning her presence. Ethan did not move right away, not because he did not know what to do, but because he knew this was the part that mattered, the part where most men would either speak too soon or walk away too fast. And he had learned a long time ago that silence, when held long enough, could say more than any promise ever could. She was the first to break it, not with words, but with a small shift of weight, her hand adjusting on the worn leather handle as if reminding herself it was still there, still hers, and then her eyes lifted again, meeting his. Without hesitation, without apology, and for the first time, there was something different in them. Not fire, not defiance, but something closer to measure, as if she were deciding whether he was real or just another passing illusion in a place that had already tried to discard her. "You did not have to do that," she said finally, her voice steady, clear, carrying the faint trace of an accent that did not belong to this town. And Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the words before. Answering, "No," he said, simple as the sky. Above them, I did not. And for a moment, that was all there was, no explanation, no attempt to soften it, just the truth laid flat between them. She studied him longer than most would dare, her gaze moving over his face, his posture, the way he stood without tension but without ease, like a man who had learned to carry weight without letting it show. And then she nodded once, a small motion, but deliberate, like she had come to some conclusion she would not share. The breeze shifted again, stronger this time, tugging at the edge of her collar until the turquoise pendant slipped free once more, resting against the fabric in full view, and Ethan saw it clearly now. The worn edges, the careful shaping, the kind of detail that spoke of hands that made things to last, not to sell, and he recognized something in it, not the symbol itself, but the meaning behind it, the way it did not ask to be understood by anyone outside of its own story. "You are not from here," he said, not as a question, and she did not look down at the pendant, did not hide it this time, only answered no, with the same quiet certainty she had carried through everything else, and that single word seemed to widen the space between them and narrow it at the same time. A wagon rattled somewhere in the distance, the sound faint but steady, a reminder that the world beyond this moment was still moving, still expecting things to return to order. And Ethan glanced once toward the road before looking back. At her, "You have somewhere to go," he said, not pushing, not assuming, just placing the question where it belonged. And for the first time, something in her expression shifted, not breaking, not softening, but revealing the smallest crack in the armor she had held so tightly. "Not here," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only fact. Ethan nodded slowly, as if that answered more than it seemed to, and then he stepped back half a pace, not to leave, but to make room, to give her the space to choose what came next. And that gesture, small as it was, carried more weight than anything he could have offered with words, because out here, in a place where everything was claimed or taken, space itself was a rare kind of respect, and she saw it, understood it, her fingers loosening on the suitcase again as she took one step forward, not past him, not away, but closer, just enough to stand beside him instead of across from him. And in that quiet shift, something unspoken settled in a place, not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that did not belong to the rules of the town behind them. They stood there for a long second that felt longer than it should have, two strangers sharing the same patch of dust as the town pretended not to watch from behind half-closed doors and shaded windows. And Ethan could feel it, that quiet pressure building again, not loud, not obvious, but there like heat rising off the ground before a storm that had not decided whether it would come. He turned first, not abruptly, not like he was walking away, but like a man who had already made up his mind. Hours ago, his boots shifting in the dirt as he glanced down the road that led out past the last fence line, past the places where people still thought they owned things that were never theirs to begin with. And then he looked back at her, just once, enough to make sure she was still there, still choosing to stand. "My place is about a mile out," he said, voice even, not offering, not insisting, just stating something that existed whether she accepted it or not. And the wind carried his words lightly between them. She did not answer right away, her eyes following the direction he had glanced, measuring the distance not in miles, but in meaning, in what it would cost to take that step and what it would cost to stay. And behind her, the town creaked and shifted, a door opening somewhere, a voice low and uncertain. The kind of sounds that meant the moment they had just shared was already being turned into a story that would not be told the right way. She bent slightly then, lifting the suitcase again, the leather worn soft from years of use. And for a second it looked heavier than before, not because of what was inside, but because of everything that had been placed on it that morning. And when she straightened, the turquoise pendant slipped forward once more, resting against her chest without being hidden, like a choice made instead of an accident. "A mile is not far," she said, her tone calm. But there was something beneath it, something that carried the weight of journeys longer than any road this town could offer, and Ethan gave a small nod, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging that distance meant different things to different people. They started walking without another word, side by side, but not too close, their steps falling into a quiet rhythm that did not need to be spoken into existence, boots pressing into the dry earth, the sound steady, grounding, as the town slowly fell behind them, its edges softening into something less certain, less important with every yard they put between it and themselves. The sun hung low, stretching their shadows long across the road, and for a while there was only that, the wind, the faint call of a bird somewhere far off, and the sense that they were crossing something invisible but real, a line that did not show itself until it was already behind you. After a few minutes, she spoke again, not looking at him this time, her eyes fixed ahead on the open land. "Why did you stay?" she asked, the question simple but not light, and Ethan let it sit there for a few steps, letting the sound of it settle before answering. "Because you did not leave," he said, and there was no explanation beyond that. No need to dress it up into something larger, and yet it carried more truth than anything else he could have said. She absorbed it without reaction, but her pace shifted slightly, just enough to tell him the answer had landed where it needed to. And for the first time since they left the town, something eased in the space between them. Not tension, not distance, but the kind of quiet that comes when two people stop trying to understand everything at once. The road stretched ahead, pale and endless under the fading light. And somewhere behind them, unseen but not forgotten, the town continued to watch, to think, to decide what came next, because moments like this did not stay small for long. And both of them knew, without saying it, that the step they had just taken was only the beginning of something the town would not let go easily. The road stretched longer than a mile when the sun began to fall, the light turning softer, gold slipping into the dust, and settling over everything like a quiet promise that the day was ending whether they were ready or not. And Ethan walked a half step ahead now, not to lead, but because the path narrowed where the ground dipped and rose again, worn by years of hooves and wagon wheels that had passed long before either of them had reasons to be here. His place came into view slowly, not all at once. First the outline of a fence line leaning just slightly where the post had weathered, then the low roof of a cabin set back from the road about 30 yards, would darken by sun and time. A small corral off to the side where two horses stood with quiet patience, lifting their heads as the pair approached, ears turning, recognizing the rhythm of the man before they saw his face. He slowed as they reached the gate, pushing it open with one hand, the hinge giving a familiar creak that did not try to hide its age. And he stepped aside then, leaving the path open, not ushering her in, not marking it as his, just allowing the space to exist without condition. She paused for a fraction of a second at the threshold, not from hesitation, but from habit, the kind that came from crossing too many places where stepping forward had consequences, and then she moved, steady as before, passing through without lowering her eyes, the suitcase brushing lightly against the wood of the gate. As she entered, the air felt different here, quieter, not empty, but settled, like it had learned to live without interruption, and the wind carried the faint scent of hay and dry earth, something grounded, something honest. Ethan closed the gate behind them without a sound beyond the soft click of wood meeting wood, and he walked toward the cabin, boots slower now, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that this place, small as it was, had just changed in a way that could not be. Undone, he stopped at the door, resting his hand against the frame for a brief second before pushing it open, the hinges moving easier than the gate, worn into familiarity, and he stepped inside first, not out of necessity, but out of instinct, crossing the threshold and then turning slightly to give her a clear view. The interior was simple. One main room with a table set near the window, a cast iron stove against the far wall, a bed tucked into the corner where the light fell softer, and everything carried the quiet order of a man who did not keep more than he needed. Tools hung where they belonged, boots placed near the door, a tin cup, resting beside a water jug that had been filled earlier that morning. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in, not with surprise, but with attention, the kind that noticed what was there and what was not, and her fingers loosened on the suitcase again, the leather handle shifting slightly in her grip as if it had been waiting for this pause. "You can leave it there," Ethan said, nodding once toward the space near the table. His voice even, not claiming, not directing, just offering. A place for something that had been carried too long. And she followed the gesture, stepping forward and setting the suitcase down with care, not dropping it, not letting it fall, but placing it as if it still mattered where it rested. The pendant slipped free again as she straightened, catching the last light that came through the window, and this time she did not tuck it away, did not hide it beneath fabric or shadow. She let it stay, visible. Part of the room now, part of this new space that had not asked for her name or her past. Ethan moved to the table, pouring water into the tin cup, the sound soft, steady, and he set it down within reach without looking directly at her, not to avoid her, but to give her the choice to take it without feeling watched. And for a long second, neither of them spoke, the quiet settling around them like something that had always been there, waiting, Outside, the sun dropped lower, shadows stretching across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, faint but certain, came the echo of a wagon wheel on the road they had left behind, a reminder that the world had not forgotten them. Not yet. And inside the small cabin, two people stood on opposite sides of a table, neither asking what came next, both knowing that whatever it was, it would not stay as simple as this moment tried to be. The quiet inside the cabin did not feel empty. It felt earned, like something that had taken years to settle in a place and was now deciding whether to stay or shift, and Ethan leaned one hand against the edge of the table, not resting, not relaxing, just anchoring himself in a space that had always belonged to him alone until this moment. While across from him, she stood with the same stillness she had carried since the town, but it had changed, softened at the edges, not weaker, just less, guarded against something that had not yet tried to take from her. The tin cup sat between them, the water inside catching the last of the light from the window, and for a few seconds it remained untouched, not out of distrust, but out of habit, the kind that comes from learning not to reach for things too quickly. And then she stepped forward, slow and deliberate, her fingers brushing the rim before lifting it, the motion careful but not hesitant, and she drank, not much, just enough to wet her throat before setting it back down in the same place it had been, as if returning something borrowed. Ethan watched that, not the act itself, but the way she did it, the control, the awareness, the quiet discipline that spoke of a life shaped by more than just circumstance. And he nodded once, almost to himself, as if confirming something he had already begun to understand. "There is food," he said after a moment, his voice low, not breaking the quiet so much as moving within it. And he gestured toward a small shelf near the stove where a loaf of bread and a piece of dried meat rested. Simple, enough for one, maybe two if measured right. And she followed the motion with her eyes, then back to him. "You planned for one," she said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what was clear, and Ethan gave a slight shrug, the corner of his mouth tightening just enough to show he understood the truth in it. "Most days," he answered, and there was no apology in it, no explanation offered beyond that. She stepped toward the shelf, her movement steady, taking the bread first, breaking it with practiced hands, not tearing, not wasting, and she placed half back where it had been before taking a small piece for herself, and that simple act shifted something again, not in the room, but in the understanding between them, a quiet agreement forming, without words about what would be taken and what would be left. The pendant rested against her chest as she moved, catching the dimming light each time she turned slightly, and Ethan found his eyes drawn to it again, not out of curiosity anymore, but recognition, like a memory he could not quite place but knew mattered. And after a long second, he spoke. "That stone," he said, not finishing the thought, leaving space for her to decide whether it should be answered. And she paused, the piece of bread still her hand, her gaze dropping briefly to the turquoise before lifting again, meeting his, and for the first time, there was something like a question in her eyes, not about him, but about what he saw. "It was given," she said quietly, and the words carried weight, not explained, not expanded, but enough to tell him that it was not something she had found, not something that could be traded or replaced. And Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that without pushing further, because out here, some things were not meant to be taken apart, only respected as they were. Outside, the light continued to fade, shadows deepening across the floorboards, stretching toward the walls like they were, reaching for something just out of sight, and the sound of the wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint echo from the road, distant but steady, and both of them heard it this time. Both of them recognized what it meant without needing to say it, that the quiet they had found was not permanent, not untouched, and Ethan straightened slightly, his posture changing in a way that was subtle but clear, not tense, not ready for conflict, but aware, present, and she saw it, felt it, her grip, tightening just slightly around the bread before she set it down, her attention turning toward the door for a brief second before returning to him. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that would change what was coming. And in that shared silence, the distance between them shifted again, not closing, not widening, but becoming something else entirely, something that did not belong to the past they had left behind or the uncertainty that was approaching, but to this moment alone, where two people who owed each other nothing had begun, without agreement or promise, to stand on the same side of something they had not yet seen. The sound came clearer this time, not just a passing echo, but a steady rhythm of wheels turning over hard ground, slow and deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where they were going and had no reason to rush. And Ethan shifted his weight just slightly, his gaze moving toward the door without fully turning, listening the way a man does when he has learned to trust the land more than words. The cabin held its quiet, but it was no longer untouched. Something had entered it without crossing. The threshold, a presence carried on distance and intent, and across from him, she stood just as still, but her stillness had changed again, not guarded now, not defensive, but focused, like she was listening to something deeper than the sound itself. "They will come," she said after a moment, her voice low, not fearful, not uncertain, just stating what she already knew, and Ethan gave a small nod, as if confirming a thought he had already reached before she spoke. "Most things do," he replied, and there was no way to surprise in it, only acceptance. The wheels outside slowed, the sound softening as the wagon reached the stretch of road just beyond the fence line. And then it stopped, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with purpose, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound had been, like the world itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Ethan moved then, not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple step toward the door, his hand brushing the frame as he passed. The motion familiar, practiced, and he opened it just enough to let the fading light spill in, casting a long line across the floor that reached toward where she stood, and through that narrow opening, the outline of the wagon could be seen, dark against the horizon, a single horse shifting its weight, reins loose, the driver still seated. Waiting, he did not step outside right away, did not speak, because there are moments when words only make things smaller, and this was not one of those moments. Behind him, she did not move closer, did not retreat. She simply stood where she was, her eyes on the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, as if grounding herself in the space that had not yet asked her to leave, and the pendant caught the last thread of light again, a quiet flash that seemed to carry its own kind of presence. After a long second, Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking under his weight, the evening air cooler now, carrying with it the scent of distant earth and something else, something like expectation, and he stopped there, not approaching the wagon, not closing the distance, just standing where he was as if to say that this line, this place would not be crossed without reason. The driver shifted slightly on the seat, the faint outline of a hat tilting just enough to suggest attention. And for a moment, neither man spoke, the distance between them filled with the kind of understanding that comes without words, each measuring the other, not in strength, not in threat, but in intent. Inside the cabin, she took one step forward, then another, slow, deliberate, until she stood just within the doorway, not behind him, not hidden but present, her gaze steady on the figure beyond the yard, and the air seemed to tighten around that small movement, as if the land itself recognized the shift. "You should not be here," the driver called finally, his voice carrying across the space, not loud, but firm, shaped by certainty more than force, and Ethan did not turn, did not raise his voice in reply. "Neither should you," he answered, simple, even, the words settling into the space between them like something that had been waiting to be said. A pause followed, longer this time, stretching until it felt like it might break, and then the driver leaned forward slightly, the horse shifting again beneath him. "You do not know what you are holding on to," he said, and there was something in the tone now, not warning, not threat, but something closer to concern, the kind that comes too late to change anything. Ethan's gaze flickered once, not to the man, but to the shadow just behind him where she stood, and then back again. "I did not take anything," he said quietly. She stayed. And that was all. No claim, no defense, just the truth as it existed in that moment. The wind moved through the yard, stirring the dust at their feet, and somewhere far beyond the fence line, something unseen shifted, as if the world itself had heard what was said and was now waiting to see what would follow. The driver did not answer right away, and that silence carried more weight than any argument could have, stretching across the yard like a line drawn in the dust that neither man seemed eager to cross. While the horse shifted again, its breath visible in the cooling air, a slow rise and fall that echoed the patience of the man holding the reins. Ethan remained where he was, one hand resting lightly against the porch post, not gripping, not bracing, just present, his posture unchanged, and behind him, she stood in the doorway, not hidden by his shadow, not stepping forward to challenge, but not stepping back either, her presence steady, undeniable, like something that had already decided it would not be moved again. The driver finally exhaled a long, measured breath that seemed to carry the weight of a road already traveled, and he reached into his coat, not in haste, not in tension, but with the calm of the man who had come prepared for this moment long before it arrived. And when his hand came back into view, it held nothing more than a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, creased from being opened too many times. He did not extend it immediately, did not offer it across the distance. Instead, he looked at Ethan first, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for something that could not be measured in words. "You think this is about choice," he said, his voice lower now, less certain than before. And the statement hung there, not quite a question, not quite. A warning. Ethan did not respond right away, his gaze steady, unreadable, and, after a second, he answered, "It is," the words simple, unadorned, carrying no need for explanation. The driver's eyes flickered then, just once, past Ethan, toward the doorway, toward her, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not frustration, not anger, but something closer to recognition, like a memory that had been buried under duty and was now rising whether he wanted it to or not. He unfolded the paper slowly, the sound soft but distinct in the quiet, and held it up. Just enough for Ethan to see the shape of it, not the words. Just the fact that it existed. "This says she belongs to a man who paid for her," he said, not raising his voice, not pressing the point, just laying it out the way the town would have, as if the paper itself carried more truth than anything standing in front of it. The wind moved again, catching the edge of the paper, making it flutter slightly, fragile against the weight it was supposed to hold, and Ethan's eyes followed the motion. For a brief second before lifting again, meeting the driver's gaze without hesitation. "Paper does not decide what a person is," he said, his tone unchanged, calm, but firm in a way that did not need force behind it. The driver's hand lowered slowly, the paper folding back in on itself, as if even it understood it had said all it could. And for a moment, no one spoke. The distance between them filled with something that was no longer about ownership or claim, but about what came after those. Ideas failed to hold. Inside the doorway, she stepped forward then, just one step, enough for the light to fall fully across her face, enough for the pendant to catch it again, brighter now against the deepening dusk, and the driver saw it clearly this time, his gaze fixing on the turquoise stone as if it had answered a question he had not known how to ask. The shift in him was subtle, but it was there, the set of his shoulders easing, the certainty in his posture giving way to something more, measured, more careful. And when he spoke again, it was not to Ethan, but to her. "You should not have been sent through that office," he said quietly, and there was no accusation in it, only fact. The kind that arrives too late to change what has already happened. She did not respond with words, but her gaze held his, steady, unyielding, and in that silence, something passed between them that Ethan did not fully understand, something older than the town, older than the road that had brought the wagon here. The driver nodded once, a small motion, but deliberate, and he gathered the reins loosely in his hand, not turning the wagon yet, not leaving, but no longer pressing forward, as if the purpose that had brought him here had shifted into something else entirely, something he had not planned for. The sky above had darkened now, the last of the lights slipping behind the horizon, and the world seemed to pause in that fading moment, waiting to see what would be chosen next. Because for the first time since the wagon had stopped, the question was no longer who she belonged to, but who would be willing to understand what she truly was. The night settled in without asking permission, the last light slipping away until the land was painted in shades of quiet blue and shadow, and still no one moved, not the man on the wagon, not Ethan on the porch, not her in the doorway, because something had already shifted and none of them were certain yet what it meant to act on it. The driver lowered his gaze for a brief second, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in thought, like a man recalculating a path he had taken too many times to question until now. And when he looked up again, the certainty that had brought him here was no longer whole. It had cracked just enough to let something else through. "You were not told everything," he said, this time to her, his voice quieter, carrying across the yard with less force, but more truth, and the words seemed to hang differently in the air, not as an argument, but as something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. She stepped forward again, just one more pace, enough to stand. Fully beside Ethan now, not behind him, not separate, but aligned in a way that did not need to be explained, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady on the man who had arrived with answers that no longer held. "I was told enough," she replied, her voice calm, but there was something beneath it now, not resistance, not anger, but clarity, the kind that comes when a person stops listening to what others have decided for them. The driver nodded slowly, absorbing that, and his hand moved again, not to the paper this time, but to the reins, gathering them loosely, his fingers adjusting with the ease of habit. Yet he did not turn the horse, did not leave, as if something in him still needed to see this moment through. Ethan shifted his stance. Slightly, the wooden boards of the porch creaking under his weight, and his gaze moved between them, not interrupting, not stepping in, because he understood this was no longer his to control, if it ever had been. The wind picked up again, brushing through the grass beyond the fence, carrying the faint sound of the distant town, muted now, like a memory already fading, and for a second, everything felt suspended between what had been and what would come next. "They will come for you," the driver said after a pause, not as a threat, not even as a warning, but as a simple truth shaped by the way the world worked beyond this yard. And the words did not break the moment. They settled into it, becoming part of the weight that had to be carried. She did not look away, did not glance back at the cabin or the road behind them. She held his gaze and answered with the same steadiness she had shown since the dust outside the post office. "They already did," she said, and in that single sentence, something closed, something that had been left open earlier in the day, now resolved without force or argument. The driver's eyes flickered then, a brief recognition passing through them, not of defeat, but of understanding, and he exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cooling air, as if releasing something he had carried longer than he realized. Ethan watched that, not the man, but the change, the subtle shift that meant this was no longer about taking her back or proving a point. It was about accepting something that did not fit into the lines that had been drawn. The horse stamped lightly once, impatient with the stillness, and the sound seemed to break whatever remained of the moments. "Hold," and the driver finally moved, not turning away yet, but straightening, his posture settling into something quieter, less rigid. "Not all roads lead back," he said, almost to himself, though the words carried clearly enough to reach them both. And then his gaze lifted once more, meeting hers, then Ethan's, as if marking them in his memory before what came next. She did not respond, but her hand rose briefly, touching the pendant at her chest, not to hide it, not to hold it in place, but to acknowledge it, to remind herself of something that could not be taken or rewritten by any paper or claim. The wagon remained where it was for one more long second, the silence stretching just enough to make the choice feel real. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the driver shifted the reins and the horse turned, the wheels creaking again as the wagon began to move, not fast, not forced, just a steady departure that carried with it everything that had changed in the space of a single evening, leaving behind a yard, a cabin, and two people standing in a quiet that no longer belonged to the past they had walked away from. The sound of the wagon faded slower than it should have, the creak of its wheels lingering across the open land like an echo that refused to leave, and Ethan stood on the porch without moving, his eyes following the shape of it long after it had begun to disappear into the darkening horizon, because he understood something simple that most men ignored, that when something leaves quietly, it does not always mean it is gone. Beside him, she remained still, her presence no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, but settled in a way that had not existed when she first stepped into the dust outside the post office. And the space between them felt different now, not divided, not cautious, but shared, like two people standing on the same side of something they had not yet named. The night deepened around them, the sky stretching wide and clear above, the first stars beginning to show in faint, scattered patterns, and the wind shifted again. Cooler now, carrying with it the kind of silence that only comes when something important has just passed and left the world slightly changed behind it. Ethan finally moved, not toward the road, not after the wagon, but back toward the door, his boots steady against the wood as he stepped inside, leaving it open behind him without thinking, because for the first time in years, the inside of that cabin did not feel like something that needed to be closed off from the world. She followed a moment later, not waiting for permission, not asking, just stepping across the threshold again, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than words. And when she entered, the air shifted once more, not unsettled, but fuller, like a place that had been empty for too long had finally been acknowledged. The tin cup still sat on the table where she had left it, the water untouched since, and she reached for it again, lifting it with the same measured motion, drinking a little more this time before setting it back down, and Ethan watched that without speaking, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that this moment did not belong to explanation, it belonged to acceptance. They will not stop, he said after a while, his voice low, steady, not warning her, not asking her to reconsider, just placing the truth in the space between them where it could exist without weight. And she turned slightly toward him, her eyes calm, clear, carrying that same quiet fire that had stopped him in the first place. "Neither will I," she answered, and there was no challenge in it, no need to prove anything, just a statement as simple and solid as the ground beneath their feet. The words settled into the room, filling it without pressure, and Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, not in approval, but in recognition, because he had seen that kind of resolve before in men who stood their ground when there was nothing left to gain, and he knew it was not something that could be given or taken, only lived. He moved toward the small shelf again, breaking another piece of bread, setting it beside the first without ceremony, and she noticed not the action itself, but what it meant, the quiet adjustment of a life that had been measured for one now, making space for two without announcement or promise. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls, the soft sound steady and constant, and somewhere far off, a distant light flickered once and disappeared, as if the world beyond their reach had just taken note of what had changed here. She stepped closer to the table, not across from him this time, but beside him, her shoulder almost aligned with his, not touching, but near enough to feel the presence. And her hand rested briefly against the edge of the wood, the same place as had been earlier, as if tracing the shape of something that had already begun to form. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, not as a demand, not as uncertainty, but as someone who understood that the next step mattered more than the last. And Ethan looked toward the open door, toward the dark land stretching beyond it, before answering. "We wait," he said, and the word carried more meaning than it seemed. Not passive, not idle, but deliberate, like a man choosing to stand still when the world expected him to move. She did not question it, did not push for more, because she understood that kind of waiting, the kind that comes before something returns, not to take, but to test. And in the quiet that followed, the cabin held them both in a space that no longer belonged to the past they had left behind, but to something still forming, something that had not yet revealed its full weight. And as the night settled fully over the land, one truth remained clear without needing to be spoken. That whatever came next would not be decided by paper, by town, or by those who believed they understood ownership, but by two people who had already chosen, without saying it, to stand and not step back. The night held steady around them, thick and quiet, The kind of silence that did not feel empty but watchful, as if the land itself had settled in to see what choice would be made next. And inside the cabin, the air carried that same weight. Not heavy, not pressing, but present in a way that could not be ignored. Ethan remained near the table, one hand resting against the worn wood, his posture relaxed but not careless. The kind of stillness that comes from years of knowing when to act and when to let the moment unfold. And across from him, she stood with that same quiet strength, her gaze moving once toward the open doorway before returning to him. Not uncertain, but aware, like someone who had learned that waiting did not mean doing nothing. The wind outside shifted again, brushing along the cabin walls, slipping through the open door in a slow breath that carried the faint scent of distant earth and something older, something that did not belong to fences or roads, and she felt it. Before she understood it, the subtle change in the air that made her lift her chin just slightly, her eyes narrowing toward the darkness beyond. Ethan noticed that, not the movement itself, but the meaning behind it, and his gaze followed hers for a brief second before settling again. Not alarmed, not tense, just present, because he had lived long enough on this land to know that not every approach needed to be met with fear. "You feel it," he said quietly, not asking, and she gave a small nod, her fingers brushing lightly against the turquoise pendant as if confirming something only she could read. "They are near," she answered, and the words carried no urgency, only certainty, the kind that did not rush because it did not need to. The sound came slowly at first, not wheels this time, not the creak of wood or the rhythm of hooves, but something softer, more deliberate, like movement that did not wish to announce itself. And yet it could not be mistaken, the faint shift of presence. Across open ground, measured, controlled, and Ethan turned his head slightly, listening, not stepping outside, not reaching for anything, just allowing the moment to come to him the way it had all evening. The horses in the corral stirred, not restless, not frightened, but attentive, their ears lifting, their bodies angling toward the same unseen point beyond the fence line, and the quiet grew deeper, not breaking but stretching, as if the land itself was making room for what approached. She stepped forward then, past the table, closer to the doorway, not rushing, not hesitating, and when she reached it, she did not stop behind Ethan this time. She moved beside him, her presence no longer separate, no longer uncertain, and the pendant caught the faint starlight, a small reflection that seemed brighter than it should have been. Out in the dark, shapes began to form, not clearly, not all at once, but enough to be known, figures moving with purpose, not scattered, not hurried, and the distance between them closed slowly, not in threat, not in demand, but in quiet intention, and Ethan remained where he was, his shoulders squared, his stance unchanged, not stepping forward, not stepping back, because he understood something simple that the town never had, that not every arrival was meant to take something away. She watched them, her expression steady, her breathing even, and there was no fear in her, no hesitation, only recognition, the kind that runs deeper than sight, deeper than sound, and when she spoke, it was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the space between them all the same. "They did not come for me," she said, and Ethan turned his head just enough to look at her, not questioning, not doubting, just listening, and in that moment, something shifted again, something quiet but undeniable, as the figures beyond the fence slowed, then stopped, not advancing, not calling out, simply standing in the dark as if waiting for something that had already begun. The wind moved once more, brushing through the yard, lifting a thin layer of dust that caught the starlight before settling again. And in that stillness, with the cabin behind them and the open land ahead, two people stood side by side as something unseen, something long in motion, finally arrived, not to claim, not to demand, but to witness what had already been chosen. They did not move closer, and that was the first thing Ethan noticed. Not what they were, not how many, but what they chose not to do, because men who came to take something always closed the distance, always filled the space with noise or force. But these figures remained still beyond the fence line, their shapes held in shadow, their presence quiet but undeniable, like the land itself had taken form and decided to stand and watch. The night wrapped around them all, the stars above clearer now, sharp against the dark sky, and the wind slowed, as if even it had paused to listen to what would be said without words. Beside him, she did not step forward, did not call out, her shoulders steady, her breath even, and her eyes fixed on the figures in a way that spoke not of fear, but of knowing, the kind that comes from recognizing something long before it reveals itself fully. One of the shapes shifted then, a single step forward, not breaking the line, not crossing the fence, just enough to catch a sliver of starlight. And in that faint light, details began to show, not clearly, but enough, the outline of a man, the posture straight, the movement controlled, and something in the way he carried himself made the silence feel heavier, not threatening, but meaningful. Ethan remained where he was, his hands loose at his sides, his stance unchanged, not preparing, not retreating, because he understood now that whatever stood out there had not come to force a choice. It had come because a choice had already been made. The man beyond the fence lifted his hand slowly, not high, not sharp, just enough to be seen, and the others behind him held their position, their stillness deliberate, their presence forming a quiet boundary that no one seemed eager to break. She stepped forward then, just one pace, enough for the light from the cabin to fall across her fully, and the turquoise pendant caught it again, brighter now against the darkness. A small point of color that seemed to draw the eye even, at a distance, and when the man beyond the fence saw it, his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, not in surprise, not in doubt, but in recognition, the kind that settles rather than startles. No words passed between them, not from him, not from her, but something moved through that silence all the same, something older than the town, older than the road, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, and Ethan felt it even without knowing its shape, the way the air seemed to hold. A different kind of weight now, not tension, not expectation, but acknowledgement. The man lowered his hand slowly, and for a long second, nothing followed, no demand, no step forward, only that quiet exchange that had already said more than any claim could carry. And then he inclined his head just slightly, a gesture small enough to miss if you were not watching, but clear enough for those who were, and behind him, the others shifted in unison, not advancing, not retreating, just adjusting as if the moment itself had moved and they were following its lead. Ethan glanced once at her, not to question, not to confirm, but to see, and her gaze remained fixed ahead, her expression unchanged, but there was something in it now, something that had not been there before, not relief, not victory, but belonging, the kind that does not ask permission because it has never needed it. The wind returned then, softer, moving through the grass beyond the fence, carrying the faintest sound of movement as the figures began to step back, not turning away abruptly, not breaking their line, but withdrawing with the same quiet purpose they had arrived with, leaving the space open again, unchanged and yet entirely different. The yard fell still once more, the fence line empty under the starlight, and Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders easing just enough to mark the end of something that had not needed to be fought. She remained where she was for a moment longer, her hand rising once more to touch the pendant lightly, not to hold it, not to hide it, but to acknowledge it. And then she stepped back, turning slightly toward the cabin, her movement calm, grounded, as if the ground beneath her had finally become something she could stand on without question. And in that quiet return, the night settled around them again, not as it had been before, but as something that had witnessed and accepted what had just passed, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt uncertain, but complete. The yard felt wider after they left, not emptier, but open in a way that made the silence easier to breathe, and Ethan stood there for a long second, his eyes still on the fence line where the figures had been, as if expecting something else to follow, something louder, something that would demand an answer, but nothing came, only the soft whisper of the wind moving through the grass and the steady rhythm of his own breath settling back into place. beside him, she turned first, not abruptly, not as if leaving something behind, but as if stepping forward into something that had already accepted her, her movement calm, certain, and she crossed the threshold into the cabin without looking back, not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer held her in the same way. Ethan followed a moment later, his boots quiet on the porch, the door left open behind him once again, and the room welcomed them in that same quiet way, unchanged and yet carrying the weight of what had just passed, the table still where it had been, the cup, the bread, the small details of a life that had begun to shift without asking permission. She moved toward the table and rested her hand there, the same place she had stood before, but this time her posture was different, not measured, not guarded, but grounded, as if the space had become something she could stand in without question, and the pendant lay against her chest in the low light, no longer catching attention, but simply existing, part of her, part of this place now. Ethan stopped a few steps away, watching her in that quiet way he had, not trying to understand everything at once, not trying to define what had changed, only recognizing that it had. And after a moment, he spoke, his voice low, steady. "They came for something else," he said, not asking, and she nodded slightly, her gaze lifting to meet his. "They came to see if I would leave," she answered, and there was no doubt in her tone, only clarity, the kind that does not need to explain itself. Ethan let that settle, the words moving through the space between them without resistance, and he gave a small nod in return, not in agreement, but in understanding, because out here, that was often the only test that mattered. Not what you claimed, not what was written, but whether you stayed when you could have walked away. The wind brushed through the doorway again, softer now, carrying the cool of the night, and somewhere beyond the cabin, the land stretched quiet and vast, unchanged, and yet marked by something that would not be, seen by those who had not been there. She moved then, stepping closer to the small window, her eyes lifting toward the open sky, the stars steady above, and for a moment she stood there without speaking, her hand rising once more to touch the pendant lightly, not out of habit now, but acknowledgement, a connection that had been tested and had not broken. "This place," she said quietly, not turning, "it does not belong to you the way they think." And Ethan watched her, considering the words. Before answering, "Nothing out here does," his voice calm, carrying that same quiet certainty that had brought him to stand when others would not, and she gave the faintest hint of a smile, not wide, not obvious, but there a small shift that softened the line of her expression without weakening it. The silence returned after that, but it was no longer the same as before, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting. It was settled, complete in a way that did not need to be filled, and Ethan moved to the table, breaking the last piece of bread, setting it down between them without thought, the gesture simple, familiar, and she stepped back from the window, returning to stand beside him, not across, not apart, but near, her presence steady, her gaze forward, and in that quiet moment, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to take, something had been decided without words, without ceremony, something that would not be written down or passed through any office, something that would not be understood by those who measured life in ownership or claim. Outside, the wind moved across the land, the stars holding their place above, and inside the small cabin, two people stood in a silence that no longer asked questions, because out here, where the world was wide and unforgiving, sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was not fight, not speak, but simply stay, and in that stillness, the kind that settles deep and lingers long after the moment has passed, the truth remained, quiet and certain that not everything worth keeping needed to be held, and not everything that stayed had ever been owned.